welcome to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today. I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and I'd like to welcome you to today's talk with Dr. Daniel Gordis, a leading Israeli historian from Shalem College in Israel. This is one of the most important programs of the year, I think, because at this time we're celebrating and recognizing the 75th anniversary of the founding of the modern state of Israel. And I want to thank all of you who've donated to make these programs possible. And we especially want to thank Drs. Holly Faust and Eve Cohen for underwriting today's program. And joining us today in the program is Dr. Bonnie Ellinger, who was a faculty member at Bar Ilan University and a resident of Israel for 35 years. And later the two of us will be in discussion with Dr. Gordis about this book. So it is a pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Gordis to the Distinguished Lecture Series to discuss the new book, Impossible Takes Longer, which is a great title, in recognition of the 75th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which plays such an important role in what I think we'll be discussing today. Dr. Gordis is the Koret Distinguished Fellow at Shalem College. He's the author of 13 books, 2 of which have won the National Jewish Book Award, which is an extraordinary accomplishment. And this new book, I think, is already on the list for a 3rd National Jewish Book Award. And if I were on the committee, I would give it the award. It is an excellent book, and I strongly recommend it to everyone who's interested in Israel today and understanding kind of how everything has arrived where it is. Starting from the Declaration of Independence and then going through the history. And it's not only history, but it's history and culture. It's people, it's the life. And if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend that this is something you will enjoy. It's the best I've read. It's well written. The historical detail is enjoyable to discover. Very readable style, but dealing with the deepest issues of importance in Israel today. Dr. Gordis is considered one of the most respected analysts of Israel and Israeli life by people across the political spectrum because of his balanced analysis. And from Alan Dershowitz to Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor of the Atlantic, and Jeffrey Goldberg said, if you ask me, of all the people you know, who cares the most about the physical, moral, and spiritual health of Israel, I would put commentator and scholar Daniel Gordis at the top of the list. So that's quite a recommendation. The Jerusalem Post has listed him as one of the world's 50 most influential Jews. So it's a pleasure for us and an honor for us that Dr. Gordis can be here today, and we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Ron, for the very, very gracious introduction. My thanks to the entire community and to the leadership of the Distinguished Lecture Series for the invitation to be here. And of course, to Bonnie also for joining us in this conversation. It's really a delight and an honor. From your mouth to God's ear when you talk about the National Jewish Book Award, but we'll see. Anyway, what I thought I would do by way of beginning is to say a little bit about why the book, why write that kind of a book at this particular moment, and just share some opening thoughts about that. And then the three of us will engage in conversation that I hope we can take in whatever direction, obviously, is the direction that you want to take it in, because that have a better sense of what the people in your community would like to talk about. Why write this book at this particular moment? I'm glad you like the title. Impossible Takes Longer is actually not my phrase. It's actually a phrase that comes from the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And their full phrase is, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes longer. So I didn't do anything about the difficult, just the impossible. But I think that part of the point here was meant to be, obviously to be a little catchy, but the part of the point was meant to be that Israel had set out for itself really an impossible set of goals when it was founded in 1948. And that leads us to a very different question, which is, what were those goals? Very often when people talk about Israel, the first thing they focus on is the conflict, occupation, obviously critically important moral, strategic issues for Israel. One could not overestimate the importance of those issues. People will talk about the often reprehensible way that the rabbinate has about talking about non-Orthodox Jews, both in Israel and outside. Again, a critical moral failing, and I'm very clear about that in the book, a critical moral failure of Israel's leadership. But that tends to be where the locus of attention comes. How's Israel doing? There's a conflict, and there's these rabbis that we don't like. And it felt to me that what that conversation does is it limits our ability to have a discussion of Israel that is elevated to the point of understanding why the country was created in the first place, of asking ourselves, why did Jews get into the state-making business when they did? For 2,000 years, Jews had been, I wouldn't say happy not having a state, but they had accommodated themselves to not having a state. Then there's an era of the nation state arising in Europe. But why get into this business? What did they want to try to accomplish? And here, by the way, I would point out that one of the very interesting things for us as Americans, and even though I'm sitting in Jerusalem tonight, also a very proud American citizen and so forth, for us as Americans, it seems kind of obvious that states have purposes. But if you go to Europe and you have this conversation, it's not so obvious to them that a state has a purpose. The first time I discovered this when I was in England, and I was talking, this goes back probably 20 years, about the purpose of states. I was comparing the purpose of America and the purpose of Israel. And somebody raised their hand and said, you know, you're having a very American conversation with yourself, because we in England don't think of ourselves as having been created for a purpose. People in France, these histories go so far back. We just have the form that we do now because we have the form that we do. We're here and we've tried to create whatever we could create as best as we possibly can. The United States, of course, was created for a very specific purpose that Thomas Jefferson was highly articulate about. The United States was created as an experiment in human self-governance. And 50 years after the United States was founded, just as Jefferson was dying, he died on July 4th, actually 50 years after America was created. He wrote a letter several days earlier apologizing that he was not going to be able to go to Washington, D.C. for the ceremonies. He was already obviously very weak. And saying, though, that he thought that he and his partners had created something rather extraordinary, which he believed would one day become the operative model of human self-governance across the world. There was a while that it looked that way. Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, in which he argued that liberal democracy and reasonably open economic markets was becoming the norm across the world. Now we've backtracked since then. We've seen in Turkey and Hungary and Poland and lots of other places, hopefully not Israel, but I'm sure we'll come back to that, a backtracking from liberal democracy. But we know why Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, etc., all got into the business of creating America. They had an idea about human self-governance. Why did the Zionists get into that business? Not to create a model that would be copied across the world. Zionists created this state because they were trying to change the existential condition of the Jew. And this is the important point that the book makes in the first part, which is that we have to understand it not as being about a conflict, not as being about religious issues, but as fundamentally trying to rescue the Jew from what early Zionist thinkers thought was a fundamentally untenable situation. They came in all different forms. Herzl was rather left and Jabotinsky was rather right. And later on, Rav Kook would be religious and the other two were not. But what many of the early Zionists all had in common, no matter how much they may have disagreed about how to handle the Arabs, how to handle religion, whether to have free markets or a socialist economy, no matter how much they may have disagreed about a whole array of things, about this, they agreed. Europe would not sustain Jewish life indefinitely. That the invitation that the Jews felt they had more in Western Europe, of course, than they did in Eastern Europe, but wherever they were, whatever permission quote unquote. The Jews felt that they had to be in Europe was going to run out. Herzl said it in the late 1800s. Jabotinsky said it in the early 1900s. This is decades before anyone outside Germany has ever heard of Adolf Hitler. They could have had no idea how right they were going to be, but they had a sense that fundamentally Jewish life in Europe was living on borrowed time. And people like Jabotinsky said explicitly, get out now. Many did and went to America. A trickle went to Israel. The first time that more European immigrants leave and go to Palestine than to America is 1924, because America has instituted immigration restrictions. Ironically, it's a whole other conversation, but ironically, if the United States had not introduced the Naturalization Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1924, it's very possible that not enough Jews would have gone to Palestine for there to be a state in the first place. I mean, you needed a certain critical mass. We had about 600,000 when the state was created. That was barely enough. But had everybody flowed to America as they had before the Americans shut their borders, who knows? There might not have even been enough people here in Palestine, now Israel, to create that country. So they wanted to end the idea of the Jews living on borrowed time. They also had a sense, many of them, Pinsker, certainly Eliezer ben Yehuda, the man who was given credit for reviving Hebrew as a spoken language, that genuine cultures and genuine peoples worth that name have their language. I mean, can you imagine Dostoevsky not in Russian? Can you imagine Flaubert not writing in French, or Camus, or whoever? In other words, there's certain languages, even if we don't speak them, we know that they have a certain way of expressing things that is just very unique. And you wouldn't have Russian civilization, unpopular though it may be these days, but you wouldn't have Russian civilization without a Russian language, without a Russian homeland. You wouldn't have French civilization without a French language and a French homeland. And there was a sense among many of these people that what they wanted to do was restore Judaism and restore the Jewish people to this place of great honor. I mean, Ben-Gurion, in his final draft of the Declaration of Independence, points out that we gave the world what he calls the book of books, the Bible. What he wants to say is we were once in a place where we influenced the entire West, and we want to restore ourselves to that. There were a whole array of other issues, which I won't get into now because I don't want to go on too long. But the idea was to change the existential condition. Obviously, it goes without saying that after pogroms in the 1880s, what were called Sufot Banegev, the storms in the South, which was the term that was given by the Zionists to the pogroms in South Russia in 1880, 1881, then pogroms that followed in Kishinev in 1903. When those pogroms, and pogrom I'm sure most of our listeners know, but perhaps not everyone, pogroms are government-sanctioned or government-instigated attacks on Jews by the local civilians. So the police might participate or they might not, but it's clear to the civilians that what they're doing is attacking Jews with the imprimatur of the government. Now, when those pogroms happened, what could Jews do? They could hope that they didn't happen again very soon. That was really the extent. And so another dimension, of course, of restoring the Jew to her ancient standing, to his ancient standing, changing the existential condition of the Jew meant that the Jew would be able to defend herself or himself. So whether it was having a homeland and not being a perennial stranger or guest, whether it was having the ability to defend yourself, whether it was restoring the Jewish people back to a lauded and lofty place in the economic markets of international culture and so on and so forth. The idea of the Jewish state was not to be in conflict, of course. Nobody creates a state to be in conflict. The idea of the state was not to have a rabbinate that would look down its nose at other non-Orthodox forms of Judaism. The idea of the state was to change the way that Jews lived in the world. As somebody who's been living in Israel for about a quarter of a century, not as much time as Bonnie lived here, but still a chunk of time, and who's been writing about Israel for a very long time, it's long seemed to me that the conversation about Israel outside of Israel, by the way, to a certain extent inside Israel also, but that's just another conversation, but that the conversation about Israel outside Israel never really starts with the question of why did we create a state? Why did the Jews want a state? And until one can answer that question, one can't really assess the degree to which it's been successful or not successful. Now, if what the Jews wanted to do was to create a place where the Jews would not be living on borrowed time, infinitely successful. If what the Jews wanted to do was to create a place where Jews, if something did happen, could defend themselves, infinitely successful. If what you wanted to do was to create a place where Jewish culture and civilization would blossom and flourish once again, including in the international markets of culture and literature and so forth, infinitely successful. If the idea was to create a place where Jews would speak their own language, beyond successful, where we would live according to a Jewish calendar and our ideals and our texts and our thoughts would permeate the curriculum of public schools, unbelievably successful. In that regard, I thought what was important about a book of this sort would be to, on the 75th anniversary, to kind of inject a new way of thinking about Israel that pulls us out of the conversation that is always centered solely on conflict or other points about Israel, which we don't like, and I don't like them any more than most of the people on this call do, so don't get me wrong. But the idea was to remind us that Israel was created for very lofty purposes, and that in many, many respects, it has achieved them, even with all of the problems that it has. And I'll just end by saying this. I believe that even though America is also, like Israel now, going through a difficult period in its history, America's been an unbelievably successful enterprise in human self-governance. Now, does America have a race problem? America has a huge race problem. And when is America going to solve that problem? I think that's a very long way off. Today's news is just as tragic as it's been throughout the week. America has an enormous gun problem. When is the gun problem going to be resolved? Probably a very, very, very long time from now. Are the race problems and the gun problems huge dents in the glossiness and the success of America? They are. They're enormous issues that nobody who cares about America dare overlook. But America has enormous accomplishments notwithstanding those issues. And what I was hoping this book might do was to get people who think about Israel, Jewish or not, but to get people who think about Israel to think in the same way. Does Israel have a conflict problem? It does. Does Israel have an occupation problem? It does. Does Israel have a lack of pluralism problem from its chief rabbinate? It does. And yet, just like America has major problems, but is still an extraordinary success, I believe, Israel has major problems, but is also a profound success. And what I was hoping the book would be able to do would be to elevate that conversation to enable readers to think anew about how to think about Israel and whether or not it's successful, and to embark from there on a conversation that I hope would be much more nuanced and sophisticated, perhaps, before people had a chance to think about some of the issues that are raised in the book. So I'll stop with that, and I really very much look forward to the conversation with Ron and Bonnie.
Daniel, thank you for that, getting us started in the process. And I'd like to follow up on one thing that you're mentioning now at the end, that something that struck me in the book. You mentioned that the idea among many people is that peace is the norm in human society, and you question that, whether the actual fact is, and you have some interesting data on the amount of time that the United States has actually been at peace, is conflict the actual norm? And do we have a delusion ourselves of thinking that peace is the norm when the reality perhaps is not that? And this question, of course, applies directly to Israel and what you were just saying.
Right. The norm is not peace, that's for sure, in most countries, in most parts of the world. I mean, no matter where one looks in the world at any given time, there are unfortunately a host of wars taking place, and now is no different. And while we were all very preoccupied with Russia and Ukraine a year ago, we've gotten very used to it, tragically. The people who are living through it are living through hell. They haven't gotten used to it, but we've gotten very used to it. I'd also point out, by the way, as you pointed out, Ron, the book mentions that The United States has been at peace, not at war, for a very, very, very small percentage of the years that it's been in existence. 10 or 15% of the years that it's been in existence, it's not been involved in any military conflict. But whether it was, in Mogadishu, or whether it was in Afghanistan, or whether it was in Iraq, or wherever. In other words, the United States has been at war for a very, very, very substantial period of its history. And that's sad. Some of those wars were very much justified. Second World War saved Western civilization. But some of those wars were unnecessary, Vietnam being the most obvious example. And many of them were failures. Vietnam perhaps being an example, the Iraq War debatable, but probably not an overwhelming success, and so on and so forth. It's just the nature of human beings that nation states tend to go to war. And what I would point out, by the way, is though Israel is in conflict with the Palestinians, we go over the last 12 months, for example, I don't know how many Israelis and Palestinians have been killed in the actual armed conflict, but not very many. Probably it's a matter of a few dozen over the course of a year. Now, for the families of those people, that's a life-shattering event that one dare not take lightly. But we're not talking about airplanes bombing people all the time. We're not talking about tanks heading out. The days of big land wars in Israel are long over. We haven't had a land war really since 2006, and that was against a terrorist organization. No standing nation states army has attacked Israel since 1973, which this year is 50 years ago. It's a half a century ago. And so even though Israel is tragically at war, thank God, we're not seeing the kinds of casualties that we saw in the kinds of wars that we had earlier on, or 2014 with Gaza and other ones. Thankfully, even though there is tragically war, the count of wounded and killed is much, much lower than it used to be, which is not good enough, but it's certainly better than a much higher count. But tragically, I mean, yeah, you look at most of the world, peace is not the native human condition. And when we look at the Bible, we don't look at it necessarily as history, but we would certainly see in it profound truths about the human condition, certainly in the early parts of Genesis. I mean, crazy thing, right? Why, if childbirth is important and natural, why should it be painful? We have the story of the Garden of Eden. If human beings are meant to coexist on the planet, why do we murder each other? And Cain and Abel is basically the origin of that story. So the Bible understands that there are certain perplexing things about the human condition that it really can't explain. So it creates what we would call, in anthropological terms, myth, which does not mean false, right? It means a story or a narrative that gives meaning to our lives. It's one of the tragic dimensions of the human world that whether you look in Africa or in Europe, or in South America, Central America, there's war. Israel is I wish we were an exception to that. We're not an exception to that, but I wanted to at least argue in the book that just because we are tragically at war, it does not mean that we can't talk about the major success of the Zionist enterprise, even if, like the American enterprise, not fully reached its ultimate potential.
Yeah.
Okay, Daniel, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. The book is wonderful. It's balanced, it's fascinating, and having lived in Israel for so many years, I, of course, was able to connect with so much of what you wrote. And I'd like to start off with this question, with this statement and a question. The founders of the state were deeply conflicted about the relationship with tradition and were intent on creating a new Jew without religion at its core.
Right.
How then has religion determined so much of Israel's 75 years? And how do you explain the power of the chief rabbis over all personal matters in Israel: birth, conversion, marriage, and death?
And divorce.
And divorce, of course.
Right.
Of course, yes.
Well, okay, there's some material to to go through. But Bonnie, I want to begin by just reiterating the importance of your opening part, because it is a substantial part of the book, which I did not go over today. But just to remind those people that have not read the book yet, of course, that it's really important to understand that the founders of Israel, who were secular, were not secular in the same way that many American Jews are secular. Many American Jews are secular because over the course of generations, things have kind of eroded and they have moved more and more away from tradition. Some of them have more of a romanticized feeling about it, some of them less, but very few slammed the door in the face of tradition and said, we want nothing of you in our lives. The Zionist leaders did exactly that, because they believed, whether they were right or wrong is a whole other issue, but they believed that part of what they thought, again, their view, the sickness of the weakness and the passivity and the victimhood of the European Jew was about a religious tradition that was so otherworldly that you didn't realize that you were living a horrible life. So Bialik, for example, I don't think this is in the book, but Bialik writes a poem about Hamatmid, the yeshiva student who sits in the Beit Midrash, the house of study, all day long. And Bialik has both a tremendous amount of love for that passionate learning, but he also ridicules it in a kind of a way at the same time. It's a love-hate. And as you pointed out, Bonnie, quite rightly, there was a real deep ambivalence. They were all products, or almost all of them, not Herzl, not Jabotinsky, but almost all of them were products of deep religious Jewish upbringings. And though they wanted no part of it in their new country, they did have a warm spot in their hearts for some of it. And they certainly knew a tremendous amount. But if I could put it very ironically, but I still think correctly, the founders of Israel would have said that the purpose of the Jewish state was to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. Now, I really think that that's actually a fair claim. It's stark, but I think it kind of just puts it right out there. They really believed that this was going to be a state that was going to be very, very Jewish, but not religious. And in being Jewish and not religious, we were going to save the Jews from the pathology of what they thought Jewish religion had become. Now, how did we end up where we got? Let me start out, where are we, right? We are not there. We are not in a state that has saved the Jewish people from the Jewish religion. Because, as you point out, the chief rabbinate has gotten a tremendous amount of power. That was Ben-Gurion's doing. Ben-Gurion continued what was called the status quo that had existed under the Turks and then the British, where the chief rabbi had a tremendous amount of power. But the chief rabbis did not used to be Haredi. They did not used to be ultra-Orthodox. If you look at Rabbi Shlomo Goren or Rabbi Herzog, who's the grandfather of the man who's now the president of the country, I mean, real Orthodox, the real deal, but very open and very modern in a certain kind of a way, and certainly no disdain for the Zionist enterprise, and certainly no disdain for the non-Jews in the country. That you had none of. And Rabbi Kook, who did not live to see the country created, but was perhaps the most important religious voice as the country's coming to be, Rabbi Kook also had no derision about the non-religious people in his community. He, in fact, hoped that some of them would become religious, and he understood that not all of them would, and he had a lot of very wonderful things to say about the secular pioneers. So first of all, how did we end up where we are in the chief rabbinate? It's not clear, but many people think that it was the settlement movement that drained the lifeblood out of the attention that was being given to it by what we would call in America, the modern Orthodox community. In other words, these were the people that were living in modernity and Orthodoxy. They were living traditional lives, but they were going to the army and they were going to university and they were getting PhDs, and some of them were pilots and some of them were physicists and some of them were businesswomen and businessmen. In other words, that world, which is partly the world that I occupy personally, and is still a world that is very pronounced in Israel, the attention of that world turned to the settlement project beginning in 67 and even more in 73. I'm not saying that necessarily critically. One can have a lot of things to say about the settlement project, but now I'm just saying it factually, not judgmentally. And that created a kind of a vacuum of attention pointed at the religious issues inside Israel. And the ultra-Orthodox rabbis who understood that they didn't really have an issue, they were not involved in the settlement project. They didn't really care about it one way or the other. They don't generally care about Israel foreign policy one way or the other. So they let that be. You guys go do what you want to do. And they sensed a vacuum inside Israel where nobody's paying attention to what is Judaism going to look like inside the Jewish state, because people were looking and talking about Judaism in its new borders. And so many people, Yossi Klein Halevi is among them, but there are many others who argue that the vacuum created by the settlement project allowed the ultra-Orthodox rabbis to sneak in and ultimately for the rabbinate to become, at first, non-Zionist and at times actually even anti-Zionist. Not so much anti right now, but certainly nothing modern about it, nothing tolerant about it, nothing pluralistic about it, nothing tolerant of women about it, nothing tolerant about LGBTQ. I mean, nothing, just zero. Now, that's where we ended up. The other thing that I would point out, and this is one of the gravely sad pieces of Israeli life today, is that if Ben-Gurion and Herzl and Jabotinsky and Nordau and Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan, and you can go down the list, believed that, as I said before, the Jewish state was going to save the Jewish people from the Jewish religion, one of the great ironies is that the Jewish state has now spawned perhaps the most ethno-nationalist, often racist variety of Judaism that we've seen in many, many centuries. Maybe ever, but certainly in many, many centuries. In other words, the kind of Judaism that is espoused by people like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir today, that Judaism just did not exist 50 years ago. It's not that it wasn't a popular movement. It just didn't exist. I mean, did you have a few rabbis here and there talking in that way? You did. But I think that what's happened is that the almost rabid secularism of the mass of Israelis also created a vacuum. And there was no moderating input. There was no, they allowed the religious world of Israel to exist in its own echo chamber and take an echo chamber and throw in conflict and throw in less and less exposure to the international world and less people studying abroad at foreign universities, less and less higher education over the course of time. And again, with a lot of doses of conflict thrown in there, you get to this, what I consider to be personally, and people on this conversation may not agree, and we'll talk about it, but an appalling variety of Judaism that is both the fault of the people who created it and the fault of the people who allowed it to be created. And by the way, it's also the fault of the people who knew that it was there, but who had formerly kept it at bay and then brought it into the government, which is Bibi Netanyahu. You know, what everyone thinks about him, and some people love him, some people hate him, and I personally am kind of in the middle. He's done some things well and some things terribly. But I think he will always bear the brunt of, and it comes to his reputation, is having opened the door to the likes of these people and having turned them from a kind of marginal variety of Judaism that was anathema to many people to being front and center in the government. It's unforgivable to me. It's done tremendous damage to Israel inside and out. And we have to defeat it. I mean, part of what animates me and my wife every Saturday night that we're out at these protests is mostly to stop the judicial reform, but it's also about the ugliness that has been imported into this government. I don't mind that there's a right-wing government that I didn't vote for. That's what democracy is. I've actually never voted for a winning party in my 25 years in Israel. I just, you know, I don't pick winners. I don't go to horse races, and I should probably stop voting. But in any event, that's okay. I have every right to lose an election and to support the government that was elected against my vote. That's fine, but not when it's racist and not when it seeks to undermine democracy. And that's what this big battle is about in Israel. So we've created something I think nobody could have foreseen 50 years ago. And we are, as a society, going to have to figure it out. Now, by the way, for all the people that I'm sure and legitimately are saying to themselves, oh my God, that's really horrible that that happened, which it is, and I don't want to diminish from that in any way, QAnon is a similar phenomenon. I mean, it's racist, it's anti-LGBTQ, it's anti-science. It's not the same thing as we got in Israel, but it's equally problematic. And it has also sprung up relatively recently in response to all kinds of social pressures and dislocations and dissatisfactions in American society. And it has made its way right up the ladder. We have people in Congress, obviously, who are well-known spokespeople for the QAnon world. It's a world that Thomas Jefferson would be rolling in his grave if he could see it. And Madison and Hamilton and Franklin, and by the way, and John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, and by the way, also Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. I mean, those are all people, I've tried to take people from all over the map. They would all have one thing in common. They would look at this kind of discourse and they would say, what in the world happened to America? So liberalism has taken some big hits in the modern world. It's taken huge hits in Hungary, Poland, and Turkey, which are no longer democracies in any meaningful way. And it's taken hits in places like the United States and Israel, hopefully not mortal blows, but serious blows. And the challenge of each society is going to be to respond to what it can see is going wrong in a way that does not trample on the rights of people to do and think what they want, but at the same time tries to restore a sense of sanity and morality to the central discourse. I think, by the way, and this I'll end, the protests in Israel are a fascinating phenomenon because they're huge. They're huge, right? I mean, it's about 200,000 people every Saturday night in a country of 9 million people. So if you were to extrapolate that out, how many people that would be in the United States protesting every Saturday night to get to 360 million people? I mean, it's just a huge, 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 huge number. But what's emerged is a very powerful political center. I mean, it's Gantz who is polling highest. And it's even Lapid, who's not a crazy left-winger in any way. The center is reemerging in Israel. And for me, that's actually a sign of great, great hope. Does that mean we're going to solve this tomorrow? No, we're not going to solve it tomorrow. Are we going to solve it in 5 years? Probably not. But does it mean that there's a huge chunk of people in the middle who care about both democracy and Judaism and want to bring Israel back to a world in which democracy and a moral, sane, non-revolting variety of Judaism carries the day? There are.
You know, one of the things that you discuss in some length in the book is the difference between the Western concept of liberal democracy and ethnic democracy, which is Israel. And that kind of feeds into what you're talking about now. Could you talk about that a little bit? How does ethnic democracy fit into this?
Right. So let's just let's explain, first of all, what the difference is. If in 50 years, the United States is mostly Asian, let's just say, and Congress is mostly Asian, and there's an Asian president, is that a failure or a success of American democracy? Well, I would say it's a success of American democracy. I mean, as long as the public offices reflect the voters, and if the voters are overwhelmingly Asian, that's who they vote, so that's what you get. That's totally fine, and the courts might reflect that, and so on and so forth. In Israel, if in 50 years, Israel is mostly Arab, and Jews are once again reduced to a minority, and therefore the Knesset, because we are a democracy, is mostly Arab, and let's say the prime minister is Arab, is that a success or a failure of Israeli democracy? Well, that's more complicated. It's a success of the apparatus of democracy, but it will undermine the purpose for which Israel was created, for the Jews once and for all not to be a minority. So there are things that Israel does to try to safeguard and to guarantee the demographic majority, first of all, that Israel has. So for example, there's a law of return. Any Jewish person, will leave aside right now who counts as a Jew, but it's very complicated and very controversial, but just play it simple for the moment. Any Jew can come to Israel and automatically say, I want to move here, and automatically be granted citizenship. Non-Jews have to apply, and sometimes it's given and sometimes it's not. Another example would be that, for example, the national anthem speaks of 2,000 years of Jewish yearning. Now, how is a Christian Arab or Muslim Arab member of the Supreme Court supposed to sing that anthem about 2,000 years of Jewish yearning? They can't, and they don't. And my own personal view is that there should be a version of Hatikva, the national anthem, in Arabic that would be in the same meter, and they could sing it along, and it would honor their Israeliness rather than their Jewishness, because they're, of course, not Jews. But I wouldn't want to get rid of the central anthem, which talks about Jewish yearning, because that's the heart, that's the beating pulse of what the state is all about. So what an ethnic democracy does is that everybody gets equal rights. In theory, just like in America, their equal rights is in theory, not in actuality, but in theory, everybody gets equal rights. But primacy is given to a particular ethnicity, in this particular case, Jewish people in the Jewish state, for the purpose of achieving the goal of what the state was created for. So Israeli Arabs would therefore have every single protection under the law that I have. No discrimination, salary equality, housing equality, and so forth. But yeah, the anthem is going to reflect my people's experience. And the symbols of the state, a flag which has a Jewish star at its center, is going to be framed to look like my prayer shawl, my talit. And the menorah, which is the symbol of the state, is going to be a symbol taken from the Arch of Titus about when our temple, our capital, thousands of years ago, was ransacked by the Romans. So it's not going to be an identity-free public square, which America has sort of tried. The phrases.
I didn't get that.
The
Could you do
naked
it
public,
again?
the naked public square in America. I'm not quite sure what that was, but the idea was not for it to be that, but for it to be deeply Jewish public square and at the same time egalitarian. Some people will say that's a pipe dream. It can never happen. I would point out that equality of rights and access is a pipe dream, even in a liberal democracy. So let's not assume that just because it may be difficult in an ethnic democracies are by definition illegitimate. If every liberal democracy had accomplished it and an ethnic democracy hadn't, that would be an interesting conversation. But all countries have this issue to face. And I use that liberal versus ethnic to show that Israel's not created for the same purpose as America, and therefore the standards of what constitutes success of its democracy, for example, have to be measured differently.
Okay. Daniel, we're
I'm
confronted.
not hearing you, Bonnie.
Oh, you don't hear? Really?
One sec.
What is that?
Okay, now I hear you. Now I hear you. Yeah.
You're hearing
Okay.
something, I think, located. Okay, Bonnie, can you talk?
I hear
I'm
you.
talking.
Yeah, okay,
Can you hear too?
got it.
Okay, good. So we're confronting a surge in anti-Semitism from both the right and the left.
Mhm.
Now, Israel has always been rather weak when it comes to hasbara, the untranslatable word, which means explaining, sort of. Okay.
Right.
Right. What is Israel doing wrong in terms of hasbara? How does one combat what is happening on college campuses as well as global anti-Semitism? What are we doing wrong? What is Israel? See, I say we. I'm still living in my head, right? What is Israel doing wrong?
Well, there are two separate issues, I think. I think that the wave of anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the world is not a result of Israel. It's a result of the virus called anti-Semitism that morphs over the course of time, but doesn't ever go away. I grew up in America. I'm 63. I was born in 59. I really think that I grew up in the best moment to be a Jew in America. I graduated college in 77. High school in 77, college in 81. I went to a college, a well-known college, wore a kippah, never had a single uncomfortable moment at all, ever. Studied in a political science department that had leading Midi scholars who were of Arabic origin. Everything was completely fine. And there was never any issues about Israel, about Judaism, about anything. The world has changed. I think that what Israel You know, everybody asks that question, right? Why can't Israel tell its story better? But why should it have to? Why doesn't France have to have a story that it tells? Why does Germany not have to tell its story? In other words, there's something perverse about people expecting, I don't mean you, obviously, but the world expecting that Israel should do a better job of explaining itself. Most other countries don't have to do that. And I think that especially now in the world in which we live, that so much of the world is seen through the matrix or the lens of, let's say, power versus powerlessness, or color, race. People apply those frameworks to their looking at Israel, and Israel can't win. In other words, if in America, in certain people's worldview, whites are by definition privileged and therefore always at fault when it comes to certain kinds of interactions. Again, I'm not taking a stand on the whole American thing. That's a different conversation altogether now. Israel is much more powerful than the Palestinians, but being more powerful doesn't necessarily mean you're wrong. But in a world in which we live today, power is almost an indictment in and of itself. So too is the perception, not the reality, but the perception that it's white Israelis fighting against brown Palestinians. As I point out in the book, Israelis who come from European descent, Ashkenazim, are now a minority of Israeli Jews. The majority of Israeli Jews came from people who came from the Levant, North Africa, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, and therefore basically are indistinguishable by looks, at least, from Arabs. And when you go to a restaurant in Jerusalem, in South Jerusalem, where I live, where there's a lot of Arabs who go to restaurants, you have to listen very, very carefully for that accent to figure out, is this a Mizrahi Jew or an Israeli Arab? Now, if they're with their own family, they're going to speak Arabic, it's going to be obvious. But if they're in a mixed crowd, the Arabs speak Hebrew and the Israelis, many of them, unfortunately, myself included, don't speak Arabic. So it's going to be in Hebrew. And if you want to know, is this a bunch of Jewish people having a meal, or is it a bunch of Jewish people and Arab people? You got to listen very closely. But so most Israeli Jews now actually look exactly like Palestinians, exactly. But the Western world doesn't have any idea about that. They think of white Israelis versus brown Palestinians. They think of powerful Israelis versus not powerful Palestinians. And those lenses, those ways of thinking about conflict in modern day America and in much of Europe, of course, too, mean you could have the best Hasbara in the world, whatever that would look like, and it wouldn't do any good. It wouldn't do any good. Now, as for the anti-Semitism thing, obviously tragic beyond belief. I've been out of America now for 25 years. We made Aliyah in 1998. And I come back regularly. And when I go to synagogues now, I'm just stunned by the amount of security. I'm stunned. In other words, when I went to synagogue in Los Angeles, there wasn't a single guard. All the doors were open. There wasn't a single guard. When we lived in Los Angeles, we lived in a neighborhood called Pico Robertson, which is one of the more densely Jewishly populated neighborhoods. And I was going back just a few weeks ago, a week before Passover. I was going to spend Friday night there, and friends had said, we're not going to be home, but you can, I know a ton of people. We lived there for 15 years, get invited out. And my wife said, you know what, you don't want to be walking alone in that neighborhood now at night, wearing a kippah. Like, there's been attacks on Jews in that neighborhood, which for all the years that we lived, there was never anything. This is a changing world. I don't think it has anything to do with Israel. I think that anti-Zionism, criticism of Israel is not anti-Zionism. Criticism of Israel is totally legitimate, like criticism of America or criticism of France or England or whatever else. I mean, criticism of Israel, criticizing a country, anybody can criticize a country. But anti-Zionism, meaning Israel shouldn't exist because it's not perfect or far from perfect, when nobody says that America shouldn't exist, and nobody's saying Russia shouldn't exist, and nobody's saying Korea shouldn't exist. When you apply a different model to Israel altogether and decide that it shouldn't exist, then it seems to me we're in the world of anti-Zionism, not just criticism of a country. And I see anti-Zionism as one of the morphs of the virus called anti-Semitism. And I think it's moving on beyond that now. I think if it was hovering there for the last 15 years, it's now moved on to, as you said, a blatant, old-fashioned kind of anti-Judaism from the right and the left. And it's ironic but tragic that very often the right and the left meet in the back there in anti-Semitism. Think about Stalin accusing the Jews of being capitalists, and many American capitalists accusing the Jews of being communists. And you had that at that period. It wasn't really so much McCarthy himself, but during that period, you had this meeting, ironically, of American right and Stalinist left agreeing about one thing: the Jews were a problem, or the problem. And that's just an old story. And I don't think anybody's done a very good job of explaining why that is. It's one of the imponderables of life. And then we mentioned the Bible before, right? When the Bible says, when the Israelites define themselves as Am levadad yishkon, a nation that simply by virtue of its nature dwells apart, not much has changed in that regard. And by the way, again, I take no joy at all in this, and I don't think anybody should. Triumphalism has no place in this conversation. But Bialik did say, and Jabotinsky did say, don't imagine for a second that the warm welcome that you're getting in the United States will last forever. What's happening in France and what's happening in Germany will come to America, they said. Mark my words. And then Bialik said, you will be drinking out of the same trough that we European Jews are drinking right now. If they were alive, they would have said, I told you so. I hope without any sense of satisfaction and just overwhelming sadness. But they would have said, I told you so. It's the norm, frankly, not the exception.
You know, we have some questions from the audience that I'd like to get to now. Alan Nadowitz says, great, we have somewhat singularly Trump similarity occurring. I mean, I think he's referring to the situation in Israel. So I don't know if you want to address that or, yeah.
No, I want to stay far away from American politics. I mean, I really think that America's politics are for Americans to talk about. What I will say is this: I think that Trump-Bibi analogies are they're tempting, and there are certain surface similarities, but there it ends. Bibi Netanyahu, for example, is a voracious reader. Voracious. He's the son of a historian. People that I know who know him say he reads at least one very significant, serious nonfiction book a week. That's 52 a year. In the middle, he's got a few other things going on in his life, obviously, right? But he's a voracious reader. He's a real, almost a scholar of Jewish history. He's an exceedingly sophisticated economic thinker. He saved Israel's economy single-handedly and privatized much of it. Again, there are certain surface similarities that I know people like to think about, and it is tempting, but I think that the personalities here are very, very, very different. And what brought them to power is different, and the way it's going to play out is probably different. Also, even though, to be sure, there are certain surface similarities that make the analogy almost inevitable.
Jack Schlechter asked, he's a rabbi, by the way, a physicist.
He's a very nice person.
He's, this guy's incredible because he actually had the chair of Oppenheimer at Los Alamos.
Oh, wow.
He's the top theoretical physicist in Los Alamos.
By the way, talk about built-in anti-Semitism. I mean, you start reading some of these biographies in Oppenheimer and others. They were not devoid of that back then either.
Oh yeah,
it was a huge Jewish project in a lot of ways. They took a lot of stuff.
So Rabbi Schlechter says, thank you for a clear and coherent summary of the issues and for gracing us with your presence. And he goes on to ask about the demographic change between with Sephardic Mizrahi Jews and how that is impacting the shifts in Israel that you've been discussing?
An excellent question. And I'll just say, I don't think I'm gracing you with my presence. I think you're honoring me by the invitation, but it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. There are a lot of people who have been saying that what we really have here is not a battle over judicial reform. What we have here really is a battle about the changing world, the shifting demographic weight between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, and therefore a different worldview. There's some truth to that, There's certainly a big shift. The demographic shift is undeniable. And that the Ashkenazim and the Mizrahim have very different worldviews is also undeniable. Mizrahim are much more embracing of religion, even if they are not observant. In other words, I'll give you an example. There's a scholar by the last name of Buzaglo, Chaim Buzaglo here in Israel, who's written that the operative concept that animates Ashkenazi traditional Judaism, we'll call it Orthodox Judaism for a second, is what he calls obedience. So in other words, there's a bunch of laws. And if you're Orthodox, you do them. And it would make no sense to be an Ashkenazi Orthodox person, do Shabbat Friday night, and then Shabbat morning, get in your car and go to the beach. It makes absolutely no sense. Because the question is, do those laws obligate you or do they not? They can't just obligate you on Friday night. It doesn't work that way. But in the Mizrahi world, he says, it actually does work that way. Because the Mizrahi impulse is not obedience, but reverence. And Mizrahim are not all of them Orthodox in quite the same way. They would never not have a Friday night dinner. They would never eat bread on Pesach. They would never not get their entire clan together on Pesach. They would never think about whether or not they're having a brit for their baby boy. You don't think about those kinds of things. You just do them. But even if you go to shul on Friday night, getting in the car and going to the beach on Shabbat morning doesn't seem nearly as crazy to them because they have a tremendous amount of reverence. They aren't as keyed into this notion of obedience. Now, that is so they are much more, they are more flexible, which ironically, by the way, is affording a model of entry into Jewish religious culture for young Ashkenazim that their own Ashkenazi rabbis don't afford them. Because the Ashkenazi rabbis want obedience. These young people are not about obedience. They're not, I don't want to buy the package, but I want to learn more. I want to be part of the conversation. I want to study some of the same texts. And here the Mizrahi world, I think, is actually making a lot possible for Ashkenazi kids. But I think about Israeli music, overwhelmingly Mizrahi these days, and laced with tremendous amounts of religious substance, even if all of the fans at the concerts are not by any means Orthodox or even observant. Yishai Rebo, the Bani family. I mean, one could go on and on and on. I want to make one caveat to, well, not a caveat, but an additional point about this Mizrahi phenomenon. The Mizrahim were the objects of tremendous, disregard, racism, patronizing, parochial at the beginning. I mean, David Ben-Gurion made no pretense that he didn't appreciate their culture. They hadn't gone to European universities. They were backward. He actually said in his diary that he thought there should be separate school systems for Ashkenazim and Mizrahim, so the Mizrahim didn't drag the Ashkenazim down to their level. Now, I mean, we kind of recoil nowadays, but that's what he said. We've made a tremendous amount of progress. And we ought, as now I'm speaking as an American Jew for a second, and as a liberal American Jew, we ought to be very proud of the progress that Israel has made. The Mizrahim have been chiefs of staff of the army, and they are all over academia, and they have taken over the cultural scene, and on and on. Are there still gaps to be filled? Of course there are, but we've made tremendous progress. What's the problem? For many American liberal Jews, many of these Mizrahim have made their way into Israeli society much more, and we're very proud of that. But they haven't adopted Western liberal values about all sorts of things. Let's say, for example, gender equality. They're not interested in it. In other words, the family, the wife could be a surgeon, or she could be a top-notch lawyer at a major Israeli law firm. But in their community, women sit here in shul and men sit there in shul. And I would just remind all of us, even though I go to an egalitarian synagogue, and that's my preference, I would remind all of us that civil rights is not about giving people rights so that they can then vote and think the way that I do. Civil rights is about giving them access and salaries and housing and secure lives so they can live the lives that they want to live. And so we're going to struggle, many of us who are instinctively liberal and American Jews, on the one hand, to take tremendous pride in the great strides that have made with Mizrahim Jews. And we're going to have to learn to understand that just because they don't buy into our views of gender roles, let's say, in synagogues or in other kinds of places, doesn't mean that they're backward, doesn't mean that they are anathema to the world that we want. It means that they have a different religious world. And I think that our struggle is to both continue to press for women's equality and to press for those liberal versions of Judaism that many of us want, understanding that imposing that on the Mizrahim would be no more legitimate than having two separate school systems for them because we don't like their culture. Their culture is their culture. We have to honor it and respect it. It's not misogynist. They just have very traditional roles for men and very traditional roles for women, and they don't want to change so quickly. That's their choice, not ours.
We have another question about going back to anti-Semitism, for example, the problems in the United States, and especially on university campuses. So one of the questions is, what do you think about how this can be confronted? You know, the BDS movement and the issues that students are confronting on American campuses now.
Yeah, it's a very painful thing to see and to watch. Very, very painful. This notion of what's called, many people are familiar with it, of course, intersectionality, which means it has a different meaning than it did when it was invented. But right now, what it means is that there are a package of liberal progressive values. They are climate, they are LGBTQ, they are perhaps defunding police, they are race, they are a whole array of things which could very well be totally legitimate, and they are anti-Israel. And to be part of that community, what intersectionality means at a certain point is you don't get to say, well, I'm with you on race and I'm with you on climate, but I'm not with you on defunding the police and I'm not with you on Israel. That doesn't wash. You either buy the package or you don't buy the package, which makes many American Jewish kids feel very frustrated because they want to be part of the progressive movements that they care deeply about gender, about race, about crime, about climate, and so forth. But they don't want to be parading there in an anti-Israel way. And they don't really have that choice. So, you know, when there were the huge protests after the horrible police killing a few years ago of George Floyd, there were campuses where I have friends who are teaching, who were telling me, for example, that, you know, for Hillel on campus went out and said, you know, Hillel against racism, Hillel against police brutality, et cetera, et cetera. And people came up to them and said, no, if you're Jewish and you're pro-Israel, you can't be at this rally, get out of here. And, you know, the people that told me about it were faculty people, my friends, but they said that the students were brokenhearted. They felt like, I can't be me. I do want to protest against police brutality. And I do want to protest against all sorts of horrible things in American society, but I don't believe Israel is horrible. And I want to be able to be in love with the Jewish state, even if I'm critical of it in some ways, without having to give up all of my other progressive causes. And one doesn't really have that option. Look, the American college campus has become a very, very difficult place to be overtly Jewish or to be overtly pro-Israel. It's just a tragically true statement. And I actually, you know, if I was a college kid now, would I get out there and do all of that? Or would I just hunker down, go to the library, study for my exams, write my papers, try to get a degree, and get out without getting into the battleground? I think I might, I'm going to be honest, I think I might just do that. I didn't seek, and there wasn't that kind of conflict on campus when I was there, but I wouldn't have sought it out. I went there to be a student. I went there to learn from really smart people and to read great books. And I got that opportunity. If being vocal about Israel meant having to give up everything else, I probably wouldn't fight it. I would probably just duck and go to the library, if people still go to the library or whatever they do these days to get books. But it's a tragic thing. We run, I work at Shalem College, which you were kind enough, Ron, to mention earlier on. And it's Israel's only liberal arts college at the moment. And I cannot tell you how many times a month we get suggestions from significant philanthropists in the United States and in Europe saying, you should open up an English-speaking college. I mean, our college is Israeli, it's all Hebrew. But you should open up an English-speaking college because there'll be a lot of American Jewish parents who would be very happy to send their kids to Israel, get a first-rate liberal arts education, learn Hebrew, learn Arabic, learn about the state of Israel and its history, and do it in a very pluralistic environment, then come back to America. But why should I spend $250,000 or $275,000 on an education in which my kid has to hide who they are? I don't think we're going to do that quite yet. I think it's a mission drift for we're still building a relatively new college, but I'm astounded by how many foundations have come to us in the last year and said, if you do this, we're in. Maybe not for all of the funding, but for very, very big chunks of funding. It's been astounding to me how leading American Jewish philanthropists are beginning to give up on the idea of American Jewish kids going to American colleges.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
I would like to call your attention once again to this. Impossible takes longer. 75 years after its creation, has Israel fulfilled its founder's dream? And there we have with Bonnie.
I don't even have a copy here, by the way. I'm in my office at work. All my copies are at home, but if I could hold up one, I would, but I don't even have a copy with me. But thank you both for doing that.
We'll do it for you.
Thank you.
Daniel Gordis, thank you so much
for
being here today.
I'm very grateful for this opportunity.
And, this what you're doing in this book is so valuable. I mean, really, I'm doing this in the sense that I strongly recommend people who haven't read it to take a look at it, because the things that we have discussed are the tip of the iceberg of all that you go through in the book, and it helps so much to get to the point of understanding where Israel started, the path that has been taken in the process, and comments about where it is today. And so we appreciate your being here, being a part of this, and third National Jewish Book Prize. Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that, but thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the really fascinating conversation. My thanks to all the people who participated online. Really a great honor. And I look forward to being in touch with you again.
Daniel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Ron, both very, very much.